And Ersatz Tango introduces us to Argentine Primer, a teaching film assembled by the March of Time staff. When this film was made, America's relationship with Argentina was tenuous at best. As World War II raged in Europe, fascism was on the rise in Argentina, and despite the recommendations of tolerance espoused here, American-Argentine relations would become increasingly tense. Roosevelt would eventually denounce the Argentine government under Peron as Nazi-fascist. Peron would shoot back, "If the Nazis did this, they had the right idea."
Is of vital importance to you and to me and to every other American citizen.
Argentines were proud of their ties to Europe. Spanish ancestry was obviously the most common lineage, but Peron claimed Italian heritage, and Eva was of Basque descent on her mother's side. The class system was heavily ingrained in Argentina. The wealthy oligarch class that Eva Peron despised owned enormous estates, often comparable in size to American counties. The poor were heavily oppressed and subjected to an extremely difficult standard of living. Eva never forgot her roots, and once she came to power, she never let anyone else forget them either. Here's Buenos Aires, the Paris of South America, as it probably looked to 15-year-old Eva Duarte on her arrival in 1936. The city was without a doubt the most sophisticated in South America, and the well-to-do spent summers in European capitals soaking up culture and buying clothing from the most haut courant designers. Many speculated that Eva's Rainbow Tour was her own version of the Grand Tour.
Great European capital.
Harrods, mentioned in the song Peron's Latest Flame, would have been completely off-limits to a young actress who had to struggle for the smallest walk-on role. The World War II era was a particularly prosperous time for the city. Argentina was one of the main suppliers of beef and grain to Europe. Argentina's thriving film industry churned out extremely forgettable films, primarily tearjerkers and historical epics. Eva did manage to get bit parts in several films: The Unhappiest Man in Town, The Charge of the Brave, and A Sweetheart in Trouble. About the kindest criticism of her acting was that she appeared wooden, although judging from the actors pictured here, she couldn't have really stuck out like a sore thumb. Eva's true medium turned out to be the radio. Her provincial accent, which she would never quite manage to overcome, made her accessible to listeners in the remote corners of the country. As Eva's fame grew, her picture would appear on the cover of Antenna magazine, a program guide similar to the American TV Guide that boasted one of the largest circulations in the country. A radio series called My Kingdom of Love made her a national star. In it, Eva would play famous women, including Queen Elizabeth I, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, and the Empress Josephine. Some would speculate that Eva's role as First Lady of Argentina was a mere continuation of the soap opera that first introduced her to the country. The area of La Boca, pictured here, is the setting for both the Buenos Aires and Another Suitcase scenes in the film.
Lined with cheap shops and cafes and dance halls.
Tabarís, mentioned in the Another Suitcase section of the shooting script, wasn't as seedy as some of the La Boca bars Eva frequented. It was, however, definitely considered bohemian. Here is the Teatro Colón, the setting of Eva's first meeting with Peron in the film. A favorite spot where the wealthy would observe ballet and opera companies from around the world, Peron would eventually stage rallies for the Descamisados here. Before they married, Eva and Peron lived in adjoining apartments in the Calle Posadas, a quiet street in a fashionable Buenos Aires neighborhood. Between Catholicism and machismo, the Perons managed to irk just about everyone. It was unheard of for a man to marry his mistress. It was probably worse when he paid attention to her political opinions.
They are steeped in the devout traditions of their Spanish ancestors. Who were
Here,
buried
a
with
carriage visits La Recoleta Cemetery. Eva's embalmed body would finally come to rest here after a 16-year disappearance. Photos of the Duarte family crypt appear at the end of the photo gallery chapter on this side of the LaserDisc. Here is the rotunda of the National Congress building where Eva's body would eventually lie in state. This relatively placid congressional session certainly wasn't typical in Peronist times. The famous Madame Pompadour speech in the film is taken verbatim from the defense of Ernesto Sammartino, a deputy Evita had expelled from office. Following the speech, Sammartino disappeared, resurfacing in Montevideo. La Prensa, too, would feel the wrath of the Perons. The paper was in a constant battle with the Perons and actually managed to stay open longer than any other serious opposition. When the Perons finally managed to close the paper in 1951, journalists around the world wore black armbands in solidarity.
A capable staff of doctors and lawyers are employed in this humanitarian...
Peron could generally count on the support of the armed forces throughout his government career. In the earliest days of the GOU, which stood for either Grupo de Oficiales Unidos, United Officers Group, or the slogan Gobierno Orden Unidad, Government, Order, Liberty, Peron would stump from garrison to garrison proclaiming the secret organization's message of a heavier-handed government. An open admirer of Mussolini, Peron refined much of his philosophy during a 1939 stint in Rome, where he had ostensibly been sent to study the Italian defense situation. When Mussolini was executed, all newsreel footage showing the dictator's body strung up by the heels was banned by Peron. Beef consumption was considered a God-given right by every Argentinian, but beef had to be rationed as the country's economy was crushed under the weight of Eva's social reforms. The 4-peso dollar of 1945 had become a 16-peso dollar by 1949. Peron's answer to the inflation was to say that it didn't matter if the peso was devalued outside the country. Everything he wanted was right in Argentina. Much of Argentina's folklore is based on the character of the gaucho. Peron got a lot of mileage out of his own upbringing. Raised in Patagonia, he could ride and rope ostriches as brilliantly as any gaucho. Peron may have been modeling himself after Argentine folk hero Juan de Rosas. This ferocious gaucho created a unified nation from Argentina's many provinces in the 19th century. He also established the first secret police. Rosas said, "It seems to me that many of the men who governed the country committed a great error. They governed very well for the cultured people, but scorned the lower classes, the people of the fields who were the men of action. I am a gaucho among gauchos. I talk as they do. I protect them. I am their attorney. I care for their interests."
...system has been preserved here. The wealth of the owners is great. The life of the peons is...
Eva's father, Juan Duarte, was an estancia owner. He met Eva's mother when she worked as a cook on his estate. All Duarte left Eva's mother was a signed document stating that Eva, her brother, and 3 sisters were indeed his. This allowed Eva to use her father's name legally, but the children were nonetheless always considered bastards. After Duarte's death, Eva and her family had to eke out a living any way they could. That included more work on estancias. Going daily from the luxury of the estancias to her family's tiny one-room house left indelible marks on Eva. Her true devotion to the poor was equaled by her hatred of the rich. The mate tea shown here was reportedly what Eva subsisted on when she first moved to Buenos Aires.
The sanitary regulations of our government...
The slaughterhouse workers were one of the most oppressed of all the poor in Argentina. Forced to work under a grim quota system, the workers were unprotected by labor laws. To receive minimum wage, the workers were forced to meet a specific daily quota. If they didn't make the quota, they didn't get paid. When productivity rose, the workers' reward was a higher quota to be completed in the same amount of time, but for the same wage. The system was called the Standard, and José Peter, a union leader prior to Cipriano Reyes, said this about it: "It converts the workers into much less than a machine, because a machine is given rest. It is cared for and repaired, while only illness and unemployment are left to the worker after the Standard has extracted his last drop of energy and ruined his health." Tuberculosis ran rampant amongst the workers and their families. The Perons not only courted the meatpackers' union, they enormously improved their lives, and the meatpackers would be their staunchest supporters throughout Eva's life.
Good neighbors. vineyards are producing grapes for Argentina's excellent...
Wine was almost as important as beef to the culture. During the Peron's regime, Eva's picture found its way onto the labels of several vineyards, and the Perons often visited agricultural festivals to boost morale throughout the provinces.
Of Mexico, they best serve the needs of only a privileged few. In the final analysis,
There's no doubt that the Perons were slap in the right place at the perfect time. They understood the working classes, and even their detractors had to admit that no one in Argentina before or since ever did as much for the poor. To this day, Argentinians identify themselves as pro or anti-Peron. Eva and Juan's legacy continues.
and the people on it.
As the first stop on the Rainbow Tour, Spain was an unqualified success. Eva Peron met with Generalissimo Francisco Franco, and the Spanish papers reported with a straight face that they had not seen such crowds since the visit of Heinrich Himmler. During this visit, Franco bestowed upon Eva the Grand Cross of Isabel the Catholic for her outstanding work with the poor, and her presence was celebrated throughout the country. Here on the balcony, the crowd of Spaniards roar their approval. Look carefully, and you can see many arms raised in the one-arm fascist salute. Eva waves back, one arm held high. Nearly all biographers agree this was her customary wave. It wasn't intended as a show of solidarity with fascism, but the contemporary press was not nearly as forgiving. A few statistics about her trip. Eva took 64 different outfits, several fur coats — she apparently forgot that Europe's seasons were reversed from Argentina's — and a large selection of jewelry. She also brought her maids, hairdresser, dressmaker, doctor, secretaries, and her personal confessor, Father Hernan Benitez. Eva's philosophy was to never dress down for her descamisados. Quite the opposite. "I once had nothing," she would say to them. "Now I have these things. You can have them too." Here, a pageant in Valencia presents her with local bounty. The common language between Spain and Argentina was tremendously helpful. Eva's theatrical speeches went over very well, as did a seemingly endless supply of peseta notes which she pressed into the hands of the crowds. Many biographers of Eva Peron speculate on the real reasons for the Rainbow Tour. Swiss bank accounts are mentioned, and one prominent biographer is convinced that the tour had sinister links to Peron's unabashed Nazi sympathies. As in all research on the Perons, the truth is at best elusive. Still smarting from recent fascist Mussolini, Italians gave Eva a decidedly mixed reception. Here, as in Evita, her escort is Prince Alessandro Ruspoli as she walks through the Vatican. She's wearing the Isabel the Catholic cross. On this visit, Eva hoped to receive the Order of Papal Marquisate, an honor which would have practically forced the oligarchs back home to accept her. Instead, she got a rosary and a kindly word, the usual gift for the wife of a visiting dignitary. Eva's Italian visit actually was cut short. The Communist Party became increasingly vociferous during her stay in Rome. The Italian president, a Democrat, told her he could not guarantee her safety, so planned visits to other cities were cancelled, and Eva went on to Paris. One of the high points of Eva's visit to Paris was presiding at the signing of this treaty, which granted France a substantial loan to buy Argentine beef and wheat. But the 90-degree heat and comments from the French press that Eva would be more interesting dressed as a piece of Argentine beef wilted the Argentine rose and cut short her stay. In addition, she had never spent such an extended period of time away from her husband. In fact, she called him every night of her visit. Great Britain's refusal of a room at Buckingham Palace for Eva's stay solidified her decision to return home to Argentina.
Returned to Washington is American Ambassador Braden, outspoken opponent of Argentina's military dictatorship, now named Assistant Secretary of State. Of Argentina's populace, Braden says,
I would hope that the American people understand that the Argentinos are genuinely democratic and sincerely our friends.
The Argentina Mr. Braden left behind was the scene just a few days before of an overwhelming demonstration in Buenos Aires against the totalitarian regime of strongman Colonel Juan Peron that has ruled the country for more than 2 years. Basta, enough, was the theme of this Liberty Day, as 500,000 men and women of all classes and political parties linked arms to defy Peron's official warning and call for free elections and a democratic Argentina. Many of these demonstrators were later jailed, but the people of Argentina are not likely to give up easily now. Colonel Peron and President Farrell, Argentina's military bosses, have suppressed freedom of speech and continued to imitate fascist techniques despite the growing antagonism of Argentina's people. Only their goose-stepping army still supports them. Today, as Argentina's populace demands a restoration of democracy, the world awaits the inevitable outcome. News from Buenos Aires. Just 3 years after Argentina's military clique seized power, Colonel Juan Peron signs the book to become Argentina's 29th president. From General Edelmiro Farrell, retiring president, he receives the mace and sash of office. Looking on is Madame Peron, the president's wife, as her husband pledges unshakable maintenance of Argentine sovereignty. Now, Argentina's armed forces pass in review before the new chief executive. Just 2 days after the inauguration came the news that Soviet Russia had resumed diplomatic relations with Argentina. President Peron was bitterly opposed by the liberal parties, but achieved large popular support.
The Perons, and Eva in particular, spent plenty of time stumping through the provinces, even after the election had been secured. Wherever they went, they would see Eva's latest portrait repeated dozens of times, with Peron's portrait right alongside. Eva was once asked if any particular piece of art moved her to tears. She replied that things did not interest her nearly as much as her dear descamisados and their plight. The Eva Duarte de Peron Social Aid Foundation offered the poor benefits they'd never previously dreamed of. Evita doubled the number of hospitals in the country in just 3 years. She built 1,000 schools, as well as orphanages, homes for the elderly, and seaside resorts for workers. She sent aid to victims of disaster throughout Argentina, as well as to the newly founded nation of Israel. She even sent America a huge shipment of food and clothing for destitute children in a moment of truly audacious generosity. America was appropriately embarrassed. One particularly odd contribution of the foundation was the City for Children, a small-scale village in a Buenos Aires suburb, complete with child-size houses, shops, a church, and playrooms for at least 200 children. There was always great speculation about whether any real children lived there or not. If Peron's constant removal of his coat and working-class agenda were savvy political moves, Eva's hours of receiving delegations and hundreds of social programs seemed to have a truer motivation. Following a rousing speech by Peron, Eva would basically reiterate his words, and she always proclaimed that everything she knew about politics had been taught to her by her Juancito. What mattered to the people was the fact that this beautiful woman cared about them and visited them in the remote corners where they lived.
In Buenos Aires, hundreds of thousands converge on Argentina's Independence Day Square to petition Juan Peron and his wife Evita to run for the presidency and vice presidency of Argentina. It's the biggest political rally in Latin American history. 2 million persons jam the broad Avenue 9th of July to make Juan Peron change his mind about running for re-election and his dynamic wife to consent to run on the same ticket. After an interval in which the crowds roared Peronista slogans, President Peron accepted, telling his backers, "We subject ourselves to the decision of the people." Then Evita tosses her hat in the ring. History's first Mr. and Mrs. Presidential team.
Following the massive rally where Eva Peron announced that she accepted the people's insistence that she run for vice president, Eva was forced to decline the nomination by various factors. Her failing health, certainly, but also strong opposition from the Peronist government. Eva's dying was a long, protracted process, and it was very public. Shortly after this footage, Eva would be photographed voting from her sickbed. Those closest to her lied about her deterioration. An edition of the newspaper was prepared especially for Eva, with all references to her condition deleted. Her dress designer continued to bring fabric and new designs for another wardrobe. It's doubtful that anyone fooled her. Eva became thinner and thinner. When she died, it's estimated she weighed around 80 pounds, and the cancer was agonizing. Never one to complain, Eva reportedly said, "I am too little for so much pain." Eva would continue to make fiery speeches throughout her illness, both on the radio and even occasionally dragging herself back to the Casa Rosada balcony. She also wrote a book, My Message. The book was apparently intended as a companion piece to Eva's earlier work, My Mission in Life, a rather turgid combination of autobiography and political diatribe, and required reading in Argentine schools under Peronism. Peron refused to have My Message published. He considered the text incendiary. My Message has recently been published in an English edition. However, the authenticity of the manuscript is disputed. Peron did publish a will, in which Evita bequeathed her jewels to Peron and her people. The money was to be set aside as a permanent fund for public housing. The final broadcast scene in Evita is a composite of several events. The rally took place in August of 1951. Evita delivered her candidacy renunciation speech as a radio broadcast in September. On October 17, 1951, filmed here, massive crowds gathered in the Plaza de Mayo. Since Peron's inauguration, October 17th had been declared the Day of Loyalty to commemorate all who had rallied together following Peron's arrest in 1946. You can catch a glimpse of Eva's brother, Juan Duarte, in this footage. He's the fellow with the mustache standing next to Peron. He had been appointed the president's private secretary. Juan would die under mysterious circumstances less than a year after his sister. Officially reported as suicide from a self-inflicted head wound, nearly all historians agree that Juan was murdered. The bullet in his head was from a .45 caliber gun. The gun next to the body was a .38. Only days before the death, Peron had forced Juan's resignation. Federal agents ransacked Duarte's office on the day he died. Peron here awards Eva with the Grand Peronista Medal Extraordinary Class for her selflessness in renouncing the vice presidential nomination. Eva here had been sick for a good year. She rarely slowed down, and in fact hated to sit while Peron was standing. In his speech, Peron officially dedicated the day to Eva, calling her the guide and standard bearer of our movement. In Argentine history, the figure of Eva Peron will be seen as one of the greatest women in humanity. A massive crowd turned out as Eva's embalmed body was taken to lie in state in the rotunda of the National Congress building. Flowers blanketed the streets, as the nation mourned for Evita. The people pulling the carriage on which her coffin rests are all members of the CGT, or General Confederation of Labor. The Perons had founded the organization. The float constructed by them shows Eva's open hands, symbolizing her generosity towards workers. Perhaps one of the oddest circumstances surrounding Evita is the fact that her body disappeared 3 months after a revolution in 1955 that overthrew Peron. No one seems to know how the body ended up in a cemetery in Milan, but that is where it turned up in 1971. Reports on the body's condition vary, depending on the source. Some report only a broken-off fingertip, while others claim that the body was seriously vandalized. Whatever the truth, the body had been preserved as the embalmers had promised. Eva's corpse was lovingly cleaned and restored, then interred in the Duarte family crypt in La Recoleta.